Hello again from North Buckinghamshire, and here we all are, still locked down and concerts being cancelled as far as the eye can stretch. So it's a good time to think about the long-term things like music and conducting in particular. I spoke a bit in my last chat about the technique of conducting, the sort of basics, and I thought it might be interesting today to talk about preparation and rehearsal. And then maybe on a subsequent occasion I can talk to you a bit about performance and how that's completely different from anything else you do as a conductor. Preparation is extremely important. If you don't really know the piece, however good your conducting techniques are, however well you manage the players' expectations, you will waste their time with things that you should know better than they do. We're all under pressure in this country because very often concerts have one single rehearsal on the day. So you need to know exactly how the music is going to work and exactly which bits you're going to rehearse at greatest length. In many cases you have only time just to play through some parts of the piece and ask the orchestra various things that you'd like them to do. English players are extraordinarily quick in their response to a conductor's requests. When I go and conduct abroad, I very often have 4 orchestral rehearsals. In England, we regard 2 as luxurious, and a single rehearsal is the standard method by which concerts are prepared. And I think many members of the public have no idea of the pressure under which musicians have to work to provide fine performances after 1 3-hour session. So, preparation starts, of course, with getting hold of your score. People sometimes say to me, what happens if you don't feel like conducting Mozart on the particular day of the concert? And I say to them, that's the difference between being an amateur and a professional, in the sense that as an amateur, if you don't feel like doing something, you don't really have to do it. But if you're being paid to turn up and conduct Mozart, you have to have that piece in your head, and it has to be dominating your life for some days before you actually have to do it, in my experience. Occasionally, of course, you have different repertoire on 2 consecutive days, and that's quite challenging. So when it comes to preparation, obviously you start with the score. The composer's intentions are what you're trying to understand and be able to express, and the full orchestral score of a large-scale piece is quite a daunting sight. Here is the score of the Dies Irae from the Verdi Requiem, the piece I was going to conduct the day after tomorrow in the Barbican with the London Mozart players, and I'm still grieving for the absence of that, and I hope you are too. Here is the score. You can see here that the woodwind players are in the first block, then the brass players in the second block, percussion just in there, and then finally the vocal parts here and the string parts here. That's a lot of different musicians making music simultaneously, and you do have to learn as a conductor to be able to take all of this in at one site. Now, of course, it's not an easy thing to do, and you have to prepare it carefully, and I often find the best thing to do when I'm learning a score is I read through it at the sort of performance tempo, so I can see the architecture of the piece. I can see where the big moments are, where the moments of extreme intensity. I can see how things build up towards something and dismantle gently after it, and those sort of architecture issues which all musicians have to confront. And then I tend to try and learn each block separately. I learn the woodwind parts, then I try and learn the brass parts, and finally I pay attention to the string parts. The vocal parts will be easier because on the whole I will have rehearsed the choir much more than the orchestra, and one's normally sung some of this music in one's youth, and that helps you to know how it goes. I sang this piece for the first time when I was 19, and you learn so many more things when you're 19 than when you're older. So there is the score that we confront straight away, and we have to identify the balance issues. I mean, for example, if I just turn over here, You can see there's an enormous racket going on here with the trumpets, and they are going to be very much louder than most of what else is going on in here, unless you balance that carefully. Of course, you want them to be thrilling, but you don't want to obliterate all this extremely difficult music which the winds are playing up here and the strings are playing down here. You don't need to read music to be able to recognise what's difficult. The blacker it is, the faster it goes. I've often said there are only two things about reading music. When the notes go up, you go up. When the notes go down, you go down. When the notes get blacker, they go faster. And when they get whiter, they go slower. So it's really quite a straightforward process, except it's perhaps not quite as simple as that makes it sound. But you learn this pattern by pattern. I tend to take a block of about 3 or 4 minutes of it. But you also need to be aware of the fact that these instruments are not always written in the key in which they sound. For example, these horns are in E flat, which means that when you see a written C on the score, they're actually playing an E flat. And that's something which does require you to be able to switch your memory from literal pitch to the pitch the instruments are actually playing in. There are various historical reasons for this. Quite a lot of modern composers actually write with all the instruments in the real keys that they're actually playing, and therefore you actually can see the real pitch you're meant to hear. But you have to learn, as a conductor, to be able to transpose in your head, and of course you have a number of clefs. Most of us know about the treble clef, and indeed about the bass clef, but as you can see here, this is an alto clef, which requires you to read with the C on the middle line, and that's something you simply have to practice. I used to play lots and lots of exercises when I was in my late teens and early 20s of a book called Studies in Score Reading by R.O. Morris and Ferguson, and it was one of the most boring experiences I can possibly contemplate, but it is the only way in which you can actually learn to transpose as you see the music. So that's the first thing, you work from the score. And as you go through the piece, you can see big moments. Look at this, huge triple Fs all over the place here, shrieking wind parts, and this, being the Dies Irae, is a very dramatic number. You don't fail to gather that the piece is meant to be frightening and dramatic. So the conductor obviously has to prepare his score. I can do anything necessary. I sometimes play bits of it on the piano because that's sometimes helpful for getting the sound of the chords into your head. And quite often I go for walks in order to see how the memory is going. I remember when I was first conducting Elgar's Enigma Variations, I went to see Sir Adrian Boult to ask his advice. It was long after I'd stopped being his student, but he was immensely generous with his time. And whenever I wanted to see him, he would make an appointment to see me in happily give an hour. He would never accept any sort of payment. He didn't drink, so I couldn't give him a nice bottle of wine. And nonetheless, I think he must have spent 50 or 60 hours with him over 7 or 8 years talking about scores I had to conduct. And in the Enigma, as you may remember, there's a long accelerando in the last movement, the movement which is about Elgar himself. It's a self-portrait. And this accelerando is quite hard to control, and though I'd never done the piece, I could feel that there was a danger that I might get faster than the final tempo I was trying to get to over the course of the 35 bars of this accelerando. And I listened to 1 or 2 recordings where that actually happened, and it clearly wasn't what was meant to happen. And the piece begins in 3 and gets gradually faster and faster and faster until it goes into 1. Which is still in triple time, but it's going too fast to be 3 separate beats for each bar. And I asked Sir Adrian where he went from 3 into 1, which is a sort of technical issue which confronts you when you're preparing a score. And he said, "Oh, I don't know, I think I'd probably go for a lot of long country walks." And at the time I thought, what a very silly thing to say. I want to know exactly where I should be in 1. And then I went away and thought about it, and after quite a lot of thought, I realised that what he was actually saying is if you have to think about the technical aspect of what you're going to do at a particular part of the piece, you simply don't know the piece well enough because the movements you're going to make have to be internalized. They can't be thought about as you do them. And I think that is absolutely true. All of the things about technique that I spoke about last week, about how you make the stick work and all that stuff, is very important and needs to be worked at by a conductor, both in rehearsals and in the privacy of his own music room. But at the point of conducting the piece, it has to be unconscious. You do it without thinking about it because you know what you want the music to do. So I go for quite a lot of long walks and run the piece through in my head in the hope that this will help me feel clearly what the tempos should be and how they are going to work, particularly when they change in the middle of a movement. Tempo is completely crucial for music. It's not just to do with being a conductor, it's also anyone who plays a solo instrument has to confront this matter. The composer gives us clues. If it's a composer like Elgar or Britten, he gives you pretty specific indications and doesn't really want you to modify it very much. Other composers give you a very general indication. Andante, walking pace, or you all walk at different speeds. I walk particularly slowly in my old age, so you have to translate that into something that makes sense of the music in your mind. And of course, having conceived of a tempo, you then have to modify it in the light of the room. If I was conducting this Dies Irae in the Barbican, where the acoustic is not enormously generous, you would have a tempo that worked. If you moved into a very resonant building, like St. Paul's Cathedral, and you used the same tempo, it would simply be a mess. So you have to adjust your tempos to the nature of the building. So you've prepared your score, you've played bits of it on a keyboard instrument if you happen to be a keyboard player, you've run the sound through in your head. Perhaps you've listened to one or two recordings occasionally. I'm not against that. Some conductors think it's somehow sacrilegious, but I don't. The danger would be if you listen to a specific recording, because you then would start subconsciously to introduce that conductor's interpretation into your own. So you have to play several different versions if you want to listen to anything at all. And quite often, of course, there is no recording. If you're doing a modern piece, there won't be any recording to listen to. Finally, of course, I actually do practice things. If there are moments where what you have to conduct is going to be quite technically complicated, I would probably associate the sound in my head with actually making some of the movements that are going to be necessary to get the piece to work. And the Dies Irae, which I did a little bit of conducting in the last video, you actually might want just to rehearse when you're going to use the left hand to place an offbeat accent. You're certainly going to want to ask yourself the question, how big is it going to be for one forte when you're going to have two fortes later? Because a very consistently loud piece like that, it's very easy to end up looking like a windmill as you conduct, and over-gesturing, and that weakens the effect it has on the players. They don't want to see you kind of doing this all the way through a piece. It's very wearing. So you have to scale your gestures in relation to the music, and it's quite a good thing to practice it, and I quite often do. To be honest, I don't practice in front of a mirror, A, because it would be so off-putting in a whole variety of ways, but also it's not really very useful. You have to internalize the feel of the pulse matching the music as it comes from your head. And that's not a bad thing to do, and it's very good upper body exercise anyway, particularly if you're isolated. So I do a bit of that, and I just make sure, and there won't be many moments when there's a lot of doubt about the gestures that are required, but there will be some. And certainly it's useful to memorize the word patterns in a choral piece so you can decide how you're going to demonstrate the emphasis you want on the text. So all this preparation is done in one's room. It can be a slightly lonely process, but you know it's going to bring forth something at the end of it. And in the next video I'll talk about how you take all this preparation into the rehearsal room and hope to convince the people in front of you that they are going to perform the piece as you believe the composer wanted you and them to do. Thank you once again for watching, and I hope to be in touch with you again soon.